Hey, this is Malcolm Coley, and I am so excited to see so many young people out here exercising their constitutional right and stand in solidarity and equality and justice for all in a very peaceful way.
This is what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like.
Good evening, and welcome to the Levine Museums of the New South program, What is it going to take? My name is Kama Pierce, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the museum. And we are happy to have you join us tonight to unpack some pretty heavy stuff that's going on in our country and around our world at this time. It was about 40 days ago when we saw a Black man shot in the street while jogging, Ahmaud Arbery. We saw a woman shot to death while she was sleeping, Breonna Taylor. We saw a white woman use a man's race to ignite some kind of feeling with the police while falsifying claims. And we saw the murder of George Floyd by police officer on a chokehold. I can't breathe. That brought back and resurrected I Can't Breathe from Eric Garner's chokehold in 2014. All of this has been occurring in the backdrop of a pandemic that has disproportionately hurt the brown and Black communities of this country. We have disproportionate numbers in the ratio of illnesses and deaths. There's been unequal access to education and high employment and loss of income. We have to unpack this. But what is it going to take? Why are we still here? Tonight, we are joined by a great panel that come from different walks of our community. If you had a chance to watch George Floyd's memorial today, Reverend Sharpton said that this is not a competition, that this is a movement, and that we need to hear everyone's voice. This is going to be the first time that we are actually walking into this space with this series, but we'll be back. We'll be back through discussion. We'll be back through different ways that we can support this community so that we are still here. The first guest that I'd like to ask to join us is no stranger to the Charlotte community. Braxton Winston is an at-large Charlotte City Council member, and he is our Community Connection Manager at Levine Museum. Braxton usually sits in this seat, but it's really important that we hear his voice as a panelist tonight. I'm not going to go into detail of everyone's bio. They are actually located on our website, New South, Museum of the New South.org. Please join that if you want to find out more information about our speakers. It's going across the screen right now. But I will tell you that Braxton seeks new models of engagement of communities who have historically been left out of the Charlotte decision process. I'm going to have Braxton join me right now. And I've asked each of the panelists when they come up and join us to just spend 2 or 3 minutes kind of reflecting on what has been happening for them personally and professionally during this really trying and hard time.
Thank you, Kama.
No problem.
Glad to be here. With all due respect, I of course wish it was under different circumstances. But my name is Braxton Winston. I am the Community Connections Manager at Levine Museum of the New South. I'm also a Charlotte City Council member serving at large. I got to Charlotte City Council 3 years ago after I was involved in similar scenes to what we've been seeing on the streets of Charlotte over the past 7 days after the death of Keith Lamont Scott in September of 2016. I saw the ability to continue my protests to fight for a change to the systemic inequities that are real and prevalent in our city, state, and nation. It wasn't just about police reform, but that is what sparked the movement in my life. And I've worked every day in that capacity to try to get us to think on a systemic level and not just from a programmatic level. With that said, these past few months have been very difficult, very difficult. We have been super productive here at the museum, but I've been focused on trying to get a huge ship in the city to switch directions. And then over the past few weeks, look, I've been a Black man for the past 30 and in 4 years, it just became too much for me. And that's why I stepped out. And these past few weeks have had me doing a lot of soul searching. Is what work have I actually done, and how much more work do I need to do? And it's obvious that we need to do a lot more work. So I've been finding ways to do that. And again, from a systemic approach, since this has happened and everything started in Charlotte a week ago. So thank you for having me. I look forward to the discussion tonight.
Thank you, Braxton. Next, I'd like to introduce Keith Cockrell. He is the Global Technology and Operations Chief Operating Officer at Bank of America. He's responsible for the GT&O programs, business controls and oversight, and business operations. Additionally, he manages the GT&O workforce strategy and related external partnerships. Keith is also a member of our Board of Trustees and has been very active in the Charlotte community. So we are happy to have him join us at this time. Hi, Keith.
Kayma, thank you.
I'm glad to see you and hear you. So, Keith, just to start off, the audience doesn't know we had a few technical issues in the background, but I'm glad that we can hear you now. Can you just reflect for us a little bit about, how you're feeling and what's been going on with you during this time?
Well, thanks. It's a pleasure for me to be with you as well, and for all of us. It's been a very, very difficult time. But, I'm over my pity party of despair, frustration, anger that many of us have felt over the last several months, for that matter. And quite frankly, I'm more energized and motivated than ever before, because I really do believe that this is a special time, a different time. And for me, I've just made the decision that it's a time for me to listen, a time for change, a time for impatience, and quite frankly, a time to make a difference. And so I'm motivated, I'm energized to be that change. Like so many folks and my friends, as well as coworkers that have reached out, they booed me, quite frankly, whether they were Black, brown, or white. Quite frankly, they may not have known what to say, but we've been outraged, because you can't explain this away. This isn't something that we can say, someone was shot, a Black man was shot, and it was in a moment, and there must be a reason that he was approaching me. I feared for my life. No, we witnessed a man beg for his mother, take his last breath. So we have a shared lived experience. So I'm motivated by the change that will come, because I can see it in the diversity of the protesters. I can see it in the outrage that we all feel. And so I'm pleased to be with you tonight so we can talk about, not just share with one another, but really talk about what we can do about ensuring that this truly will be the change that we're all seeking.
Thank you, Keith. Absolutely. And I just do want to remind the audience that if you're on Facebook, please take the time. If you have questions, can't promise that we can get to all of them, but interact with each other through joining on the comment section. Next, I'd like to introduce Jesse Curitan, who is Chief Consumer Officer and Executive Vice President for Novant Health. In this executive role, he's the visionary who leads payer, contracting, marketing, public relations, community engagement, the foundations and outreach, corporate health, and other business functions. He is credited with unifying the system through rebranding initiative that showcases Novant Health's commitment to building a culture of wellness and consumer engagement. Jesse, how are you?
I'm fine, Kim. How are you?
Good. Thanks for being with us.
Absolutely.
I know you've heard the question posed to everyone, so give us your thoughts.
So first of all, let me thank you, Kema, and the Museum of the New South for hosting this dialogue, because I truly believe that it's going to take dialogue and action to move things forward. I will tell you, I am a native Charlottean. I was born in this community, not too far from uptown Charlotte, in a housing project called Southside Homes. And so I've been fortunate, born in the projects and have an opportunity to navigate through corporate America. But I would tell you that the last 8 days have been extremely tough. And the reason it's been tough, because as African Americans, our families, people of color, for us to navigate through this life that we have to live in, we have to put things in a box, and we have to hide it in places so that we can navigate and so that we can look like we're like everybody else. I was sharing a conversation with our company just this week. We had a call this week for everyone in the company, and part of it was helping them understand what we have to navigate through, just to look normal, right? And so if right now I'm talking about African-American men, right? This is about African-Americans. It's about African-American families. But right now I'm talking about African-American men. We put things in a place so that we can navigate and move forward. And this week, the last 8 days with, the shooting that took place with Ahmaud, to your point, the death of George Floyd, and the impact of what happened in New York, those things occurred because someone made assumptions about the individuals based on the color of their skin. So I'm a firm believer that God is in all of this. And I do think, as Keith mentioned, and I think you implied as well, there's an opportunity here as we unpack this. And I think the opportunity is for us to take this discussion around social injustice and disparities to another level and come up with some solutions that will change generations.
Thank you, Jesse. Appreciate that. So last but definitely not least, we have Dr. Jennifer Dixon Mcknight. And she is an assistant professor at Winthrop University, where she teaches courses in African American history and United States history. Her research interests include African American history, United States history, and women's and gender history, with a particular focus on using oral history to examine social movements forged by African American women. We are a history museum at the Levine Museum, and history is a very important part of the discussion for us. So, Professor, come on up.
Hi, Kema.
How are you?
I wanted to say, how are you? I wanted to say thank you for having me, and I'm excited about this discussion. I actually have been, I spent some time trying to put together some remarks to prepare for this evening, and it occurred to me that that's not going to work, that this discussion needs to be organic, and that we have arrived in a time where there has to be change, and calling on our ancestors, Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and Dr. King, and the list goes on and on and on. We have reached a point where the pot is boiling over. And what is really troubling for me as someone that teaches history, and my students and I are constantly, sort of grappling with and uncovering and peeling back the layers of all that has occurred here in this country. The troubling piece for me is that none of this is new. And that really and truly, that, if we look at some of the things that have transpired in the past, we can draw very strong parallels, very strong connections to very specific moments that have occurred in our nation's history. And so it is this moment where we have to decide how we're going to move forward. And, there's that old saying that, history repeats itself. And if we don't learn from it, we'll continue to make those same mistakes. Obviously something has to be different. We have to do something different going forward. And so I'm excited about this discussion this evening and to be able to share with you all and to begin in the process of that. I'm new to the area, my family and I. We're from North Carolina originally, but we have recently moved to this area. And so I'm excited about figuring out how to sort of get boots on the ground and make contribution in a way that is meaningful and impactful and will set the stage for future generations.
Well, we are fortunate to have you in this community. Your voice is an important one. And so I'm going to stay with you for a little bit. And on the background, we have a wonderful program director, Alex, who is kind of bringing people in and out. But Professor, we need you to help us put this in a historical context.
Okay.
How does history inform us with what we're seeing still occurring in 2020 in this country?
So as I was trying to figure out how to answer that question, that's a big question, right? It's a big question. There's a particular moment in our history that comes to mind. And I want everyone to just take a moment and envision this with me. Let's go back to 1934 in Marianna, Florida. There's a young man, 23-year-old farmhand by the name of Claude Neal. Okay. Claude Neal has a young daughter. He has a wife. He works on a local farm owned by the Kennedy family. And he is or has allegedly been having an affair with the farmer's young daughter, 19-year-old daughter. So the daughter comes up missing, and ultimately they find her body. She's been murdered. Within hours of the discovery of her body, Claude Neal is arrested and charged with her murder. Okay. So Claude Neal is obviously taken to jail, but because we are at that period in an era of lynching, he is moved to several different jails in Florida, within the state of Florida. Eventually, they move him about 200 miles away to a jail in Alabama. Regardless, a lynch mob of about 100 people show up at that jail in Alabama, and they are able to get Claude Neal and take him back to Florida. Okay. Now, in this, them capturing Claude Neal from this jail, they issue an announcement. The lynch mob does. They issue an announcement that they intend to lynch Claude Neal that evening between 8 and 9 o'clock. Newspapers and radio stations all over the nation broadcast and track the progress of this lynch mob. So I think it's really important in a moment when I'm talking about what's happening in 1934 that we're real clear about what we can connect it to in 2020, right? So newspapers all over the nation broadcast and radio stations, broadcast and report on the progress of this lynch mob. They get Claude Neal back to Florida. They have to reduce the number of lynchers because they want to be able to control how this process is carried out. Okay. They take Claude Neal out to the woods, and for 12 hours, they torture him. And I want to say, just to be real clear, when I say they tortured him, they castrated him. They forced him to eat his penis and testicles. okay? They cut off all of his fingers and toes, which, by the way, were kept by several people as souvenirs. They stabbed him, they shot him, they would hang him up and drop him, just hang him up just to the point before he would die and drop him down, and hang him up and drop him down. Ultimately, they killed Claude Neal. But to add further insult and degradation to his life, to his body, they tied his body to the back of a pickup truck, and they drove him, dragging him on the back of that pickup truck back to the Kennedy farm where the young lady lived, originally, that had been murdered, and allowing the young lady's family and other people that decided to gather, that came back to the Kennedy farm from all over the place. Some sources said there were hundreds and hundreds of people stabbing his body, mutilating his body, others driving over his body with their cars. And finally, they took Claude Neal's body and hung it in the Mariana Courthouse Square, where members of the Mariana community took pictures of his body and sold the images around town. So I said all of that to say that when in a moment like what's happening right now, we have to be really clear about how we got here. Now, this happened to Claude Neal in 1934. I didn't say 1834. We're talking less than 100 years ago. Lynching in the South in particular did not stop until late 1960s, early 70s. And many would point out that there have been a number of instances, even in more recent years, of lynchings by hanging. Now, we can talk about what happened with George Floyd, and we can talk about other instances that we can categorize as lynching, right? But when we think about the experience of African Americans in this country in particular, we have to be real clear about a few things. First of all, the country was not designed. Our national government, our economy, our society was not designed with Black people as free people in mind. When you think about the United States Constitution, right, it does not talk about Black people as free people. It does talk about Black people counting as 3/5 of a person, enslaved Black people, for the purpose of representation. So we need to be clear from a government standpoint how the nation has viewed Black people from the beginning. When you think about the institution of slavery, right? The country's economy has been built on the backs of African Americans in positions of bondage. And we could talk for days about the level of brutality, the disregard of humanity that African Americans experienced under the institution of slavery. When we move beyond slavery and into an era of Jim Crow, right? We're talking about the period after 1865, right? Going into, some would argue, mid-1960s, early 1970s, where African Americans are still trying to fight for some semblance of freedom. Whenever the Civil War happens, the North wins, slavery ends, African Americans don't immediately shift into a free society or an experience as free people. They go through generations of segregation. They go through generations of racial violence. They go through generations of exclusion and racism. And so, and much of which was not only institutionalized, systematic, but also in many cases sanctioned by both local and national government. And so when we think about where we are as a nation right now, we have to understand, and I think about it sort of like a volcano, right? When you think about a volcano, there's this constant sort of pressure building that ultimately leads to an eruption. And over time, that pressure builds again, it leads to another eruption. The only way to change or to alleviate the eruption and the danger and destruction that the volcano causes is to completely shift the very nature of the volcano. So in our country, where we are right now, is that we're going to have to figure out, because if we go back to that lynching of Claude Neal in 1934, if we go back to the lynchings in 1945, the 1950s, the 1960s, and we think about those images that we've seen of those moments, right? We think about the young people that are standing around those dead bodies hanging from trees, the way that children are running around in those areas playfully and joyfully existing. We have to be real clear that those individuals are our local politicians. They are our police officers. They are our judges, our banking executives. They are people that we come in contact with on a daily basis.
Absolutely, Professor. And, you know, as you talk about that image, and it was, you know, just 100 years ago, and you say to yourself, that would never happen in 2020. But, you know, you get on social media right now, and we have young youth mimicking the death of George Floyd. And it's a joke with their knee. And so it's disheartening, but you can imagine it happening now. So, you know, we need to know this history. But what do you think, and I'm going to have Alex bring our other panelists in to kind of join us at this point, but what do you think is the responsibility of our historians in this society in this conversation?
So I think, you know, it's a really interesting place that we find ourselves in the profession, particularly for those of us who are, and it, you know, so let me back up. So first of all, when you talk about teaching Black history, right, I come up against all the time, both from a professional standpoint and in terms of the people, my colleagues, not my current colleagues, thankfully, but I have in the past come up with or against people in the profession who challenge the validity of what I teach. And we have to also consider that, you know, Black history is sort of secondary to U.S. history. So we teach U.S. history. That's what we focus on. African-American history tends to be an elective. So people can choose whether they want to engage in this conversation or not. When the reality is we all need to have this as a part of our foundational education. This is, or the African-American experience is the American experience. And you cannot talk about American history without talking about African-American history. And we could talk on and on and on about all of the other marginal histories that we have to get into. But as a historian, our responsibility is to really begin to reshape how we approach, prioritize the importance of what we teach. And it's true that all of us have different areas that we specialize in, but when we talk about those classrooms where we are teaching our students about American history, we cannot overlook, and this is from grade school on up. Many of my students come into the classroom and have never had an in-depth conversation or discussion about African-American history. So they're moving through the world with very little knowledge, and that's both my white students and my Black students, right? And any of my students in different communities and ethnicities. And so how do we understand how to fully engage in change right now if people don't fully understand sort of where we're springboarding from? If people don't understand that this is not just happening right now. We've been dealing with George Floyd for generations, right? I read something the other day that people think we're people think we're crying about George Floyd right now, but we haven't gotten over Emmett Till yet, right? We haven't gotten over Claude Neal yet. We haven't gotten over the Lawrences yet, the mother and son that were, we just have not gotten over the devastation of slavery. We're still grappling with that as part of our history. And so I think our responsibility is to start having more, both in the classroom and outside of the classroom, and figure out ways to take this information to broader spaces. We're going to have to stop relying on the institutions or institutions of education to push this information forward. We're going to figure out how to have spaces where we're doing this more broadly. And even if it has to be more informally, we're going to have to start pushing this out in greater ways and broader ways.
Okay, and I'm going to throw it to our other panelists because all three of you, I know, are fathers. You've raised children. You have seen history. Do you have anything to add to what the professor is telling us tonight?
Let me just start by saying, I agree with all said by Dr. Dixon Mcknight. And one of the things that we've learned, even as over the last 4 years or so with the incident that happened in Charlotte back in 2016, the corporate leaders and community leaders taking these racism courses that really speaks to the history of our country, and all of it is American history. And I could not agree more that that's part of the opportunity, that we help people, educate people that this is ingrained in our history. It's not new. It's been part of our experience for the last 400 years. And I think that becomes part of the solution. One of the things that again, the silver lining, I mentioned the gods and everything, is the fact that we're having these conversations because we're going to have to deal with it. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar of recent was quoted as saying that racism and social injustice is everywhere, but you can't see it. It's like dust, right? And then the analogy is so spot on in that the only way you can see the dust is by shining a light on it. And so to the point that was made, we have to educate, and that has to be part and indoctrinated in our education systems because it's part of our history. It's an ugly part of our history, but we have to talk about it. And we have to accept the fact that racism and social injustice is everywhere. And whether it's in corporate America, whether it's in the community, whether it's in job force, it's everywhere. And we have to talk about it like it exists. It's that pervasive. And that's how I think we begin to create change. I am hopeful that as I have seen the rallies, even in Charlotte, I have seen a diverse group of people coming out. I've seen a couple of rallies in Uptown Charlotte. There were more white people in the rallies than there were African Americans in the rallies. So I'm hopeful that this is the beginning of a conversation, Dr. Dixon Mcknight, that forces us or allows us to have the conversations and the education that you're talking about, make it a major part of our civilization and how we network and make things happen.
And Jesse, thank you for bringing up the protests that are going on. And we know as a community in Charlotte, going back to 2016 when we had those protests and we had these conversations, but we're still here, what is it going to take? I don't know if you all caught President Obama yesterday when he said that there are actually reports out there that have done, based upon data and research that, we can actually have some standards put in place that would address this implicit bias and to improve our community police. But he said that the report clearly shows that the reforms have to happen at the local level. Okay, it has to happen at the local level. Councilman Braxton, you are the poster child for us of that 2016 time, right? And for those of you that are not aware, on September 20th, 2016, Keith Lamont Scott was a 43-year-old African-American. He was shot and killed by a police officer. And it tore our community apart. And Braxton was a poster child out there protesting. And a year later, he won the seat for Charlotte City Council on the platform for police reform. But Braxton, I got to tell you, we're still here 4 years later. So, what's it going to take?
Yes. So one thing, I hope you don't take this as a pushback. I don't accept the term that I was a poster child. I might have made my image might have made it on many different screens, but I no way owned what happened out there or what we did. This was a group of concerned citizens that was decentralized, that we all came together. to fight and work for the Charlotte, the North Carolina, and the country that we all believe that we deserve.
Duly noted. I won't say that again.
No. But
tell me about answer the question though, because
no, no, absolutely. But I think that's an important part of the context, because I chose to take this is just a step that I chose to take. But I wanted to get to Dr. Dixon Mcknight and point about how we put history into this. I can tell you that the government rarely uses history or historical context in our decision making, and it is sad. It is something that I have tried to incorporate into the process. And when I've been doing so, I'm looked upon quite strangely. I'm commented on that I'm an activist, or I have a certain agenda. It's troubling because even what we learn about in history is often attributed to the decisions that governments make, right? Whether it be by laws, whether it be by ordinances, whether it be by positions that are taken, or the way we spend money. I believe the reason why we don't, as a government, when I say we, our government, don't like to use historical context, specifically in America, is that by doing so, you would have to admit to wrongdoing, and you would have to incorporate restorative and reparative legislations or actions, or you would have to go onto the record and say that you acknowledge history, but you are going to do nothing about it, even though you have the tools to do so. And that's where we are here in Charlotte. We have not committed to the systemic changes and the precedents that we have set. And I can tell you it's simply because we don't have the political will. It is, and we don't have the political will because we have a good thing going here in Charlotte. We have all the problems of any place in America and the world, but there have been a lot of folks that have worked very hard over many decades to ensure that more people are able to get a piece of the pie. Not all people, but perhaps more people are able to get a piece of the pie. So we've worked specifically, what we work here in Charlotte is we covet the public-private partnership, right? My organization, the City of Charlotte, has worked very closely with Mr. Cockrell's and Mr. Curitan's organizations, right? Bank of America and Novant. Their organizations have given a tremendous amount of economic capital to us, intellectual capital. These gentlemen, along with their peers, have invested their own personal wealth and put their images and on the line to work with us and demand certain changes. If I was them, I'm not going to speak for them, but if I was them, I would question me. I would question us. Where is all the work, all the investment that we've committed to over the past 4 years, right? Where are all these reforms that we've had press conferences for, and checks cut, and handshaking, and smiles given? You know, where is the policy and the results of that policy when the rubber really hits the road again, as it has done over this past week? Where is my return on investment? And I will tell you that you don't have the return on investment that you have, precisely because we are not taking a historical approach to the work that we have and the tools that we have before us. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, you know, and Keith, let me just kick this to you, because the community might not know that a year ago we brought the Legacy of Lynching exhibit, a portion of it, and we had Brian Stevenson come and join us as a community, and Keith spearheaded that initiative, and it meant a lot to him to get families of color to kind of underwrite that, because that is our history. And Jesse and his wife were part of that. You know, he wanted to bring that to the forefront. So Keith, I know that knowing this history and connecting it to what's happening now is really important to you. So what do you say to Braxton when he says we should be pushing our local elected officials more on this when we do all of these efforts and have all these conversations?
First, I would say that there has been progress since our police-involved shooting. But quite frankly, it's progress that none of us are satisfied with. And so I agree with Braxton that we must demand more from our local government, our state government, as well as our federal government. We must demand more from even my company, which I think is an outstanding, Make America is an outstanding firm. But I must demand more from them. And quite frankly, you should demand more of yourself, and I demand more of myself, because what we've witnessed is something that, you know, hits us to the core. And when do we say enough is enough? When it become okay to call kids hoodlums? I don't want anyone calling my child a hoodlum. When I see the rioting that's occurred in the protests, and there's been, let's be clear, there's been protests across all 50 states. That tells me something. Personally, I'm not aware of this mystery organization, Antifa. I don't personally know anyone who's in the organization. I don't even know anyone who knows much about the organization. This is a groundswell of intolerance about opportunity and racism. And it's time for us to acknowledge that it's unacceptable. So I'm encouraged by the youth, not just what Jesse and I and Braxton and you do each and every day, but this new generation isn't going to tolerate the things that we tolerate. And I'm proud of the fact that it's going to take greater leadership. And what these incidents have caused, and why I believe it is different this time around, is a level of intolerance now. You can't explain it away. For almost 10 minutes, we watched a man die. And so what are we going to do? So there's some specific things that we must demand more of. There is a plan for 21st century policing. It's now time for us to enact it. It's unacceptable in our community that the police chief cannot fire a police officer that's not worthy of wearing the badge. That law is in the books. It's up to us to change that law. Yeah. And I submit that now is the time. It's up to us to demand that chokeholds or strangleholds are no longer acceptable.
But, how do we do that when we are seeing, people say kind of our democracy has been challenged and stretched to when we have someone who's in the highest office who's challenging the legal system, challenging judges and the role that they play. Braxton, we look to our elected officials to be our voice, but it seems like when we have this standstill and we're just hitting up a brick wall, no matter how many young people march, because that's been happening before, nothing's going to get done unless something happens on that level. And how do we as private citizens help?
Before Braxton, before you respond, I just wanted to jump in just a little bit.
Oh, please.
To the statement that was made, earlier, because I agree with all this being said. So there are a number of things that's taken place, since 2016, whether it's in banking or whether it's in healthcare. But I will be the first to submit to you, whatever we've accomplished, it's just table stakes. And I'm going to come back to that point. I want to come back to what we have learned about COVID. And so, has the banking system with Keith and his leadership and Bank of America and other institutions, have there been things that have happened, since then? Absolutely. But it will never be enough. Over $200 million raised to go into affordable housing, healthcare organizations. We spent $1 billion last year alone in community benefit. That's making sure that communities are healthy, charity care. I can go down the list, but I'm telling you, it is not enough, right? Let me tell you why it's not enough. And let me come back to COVID. The reason it's not enough is because what we're dealing with is a pandemic on social injustice and racism. right? And so what have we learned from COVID? We've learned, one, that we're all interconnected, right? And whenever there's a pandemic, you have to have the type of movement that we've had around COVID and the willingness to shut the economy down, to do what we need to do, really to make things right. We're interconnected. We need each other. We're dependent on each other. There are vulnerabilities that exist into the community in a disproportionate way among African-American communities. So what I submit to you is it'll never be enough. There's a 2050 plan in this community because this is a marathon. We can't fix it in a couple of years. It's going to take all of the things that Dr. Dixon Mcknight has talked about, and it's going to take a COVID type of pandemic, type of shut the economy down, type of we got to change the way we live kind of impact, in my view, to begin to change some of the things that are impacting our people and our companies and our communities and disparities and everything else.
I will say one thing that's become more clear over this past week and became clear to me over this past 4 years and why I ran, that it's not a mystery how we do this. And I'm sorry, we don't need more task forces. We don't need even a shutdown, another pandemic. In Charlotte, we need 6 votes to change things. And what you have is that's where the change happens. When we talk about how do we reform police, you go to your city council and your manager. That's who runs that department. When the Cross Charlotte Trail was $77 million over budget, we changed things in the engineering and economic development department in a month. We can do the same thing for police if, again, we have the political will. We have not, right? We could have, for instance, I will be rolling out a plan over the next 24 hours to show how citizens can compel the decision makers, me and my colleagues, to not just do the window dressing things, but through controlling the budget and controlling the policies of departments, you can make real changes now. I guess you need support from the community, specifically the business community, for some of my colleagues to make certain changes, to go into the unknown, the quote unquote unknown. And I'm going to roll out a plan to do that. It's not that difficult. These are words on pieces of paper, and those words are very easily changed. We know what it means to be a good human being and how to treat one another with quality and respect, regardless of the service that you have to provide them, whether it be water, or whether it be a ride on a bus, or whether it be resolving a conflict amongst neighbors. So we can do this. The changes are obvious, and the changes can be made if you are in a city like Charlotte, where you have a council manager form of government. Your city council is your pathway to making those changes. In a strong mayor form of government, it is the mayor who can make those changes. It's not a mystery.
Thank you, Braxton, for that. And Keith and Jesse, I'm gonna have you weigh in on this because, recently there was a New York Times article that ran that said corporate voices get behind Black Lives Matter. And that's a unique heading because usually major corporations are wary of kind of a conflict or upsetting their stakeholders and taking a stance. And this feels a little bit different because companies are coming forward. Gentlemen like you two, African-American men in positions of power where your voice is being heard. All of that exists. And I'm not trying to be the naysayer, but that also existed for us in Charlotte in 2016, right? Maybe not as many, but we had, One Charlotte, we had initiatives, we had conversations, and then we're here. So, what's happening with your institutions? What kind of conversations that you can share with us that will make this different? Are you thinking in the same kind of terms that Braxton just kind of laid out for us?
What came up real quick before you move on to that question, Can I weigh in on
Please.
going back to Braxton's point?
Yes.
I just wanted to make sure that as we are having these discussions, that we remember that we have to grapple not just with the issue of race and racial injustice, but we have to also grapple with the issue of class. And that there are a number of people within our community, within the Black community, across the nation, that continue to sort of fall through the gaps because of their socioeconomic status. And so, you know, I think back to, you know, the 40s, whenever the Social Security Act, you know, came through and the sort of Social Security system was designed, and there were groups of people, mainly domestics and agricultural workers, who were excluded from those benefits, and they weren't able to get benefits because of their occupation. Those groups of people were largely African Americans. And so there was support being provided for some people, but it wasn't spread out to all the people. And there were groups of people that were being, I would argue, intentionally excluded because of their socioeconomic status. And so I think about, going back to Braxton's point about change and the things that we need to think about going forward. And Keith brought up the youth, right? So I think that we have to make sure that as we're moving forward as a community, that we're taking all of these things into consideration, that there are groups of people who have a strong voice, but they tend to get left out of the conversation in many ways. They tend to be overlooked in terms of resource. They tend to be the loudest voices, if that makes, and the least heard, if that makes any sense. Historically, right, we know that the working class has driven activism. They've driven change across the nation in terms of racial injustice, in terms of police brutality, in terms of economic injustice, right? And so I want us to make sure that as we're having this conversation, that we don't overlook the fact that class is something that we have to really be honest about and grapple with going forward, which I think goes to, and will also sort of tie into what Keith and Jesse will be talking about with their corporations, right? How does corporate America connect to the working class? And how do we bring everyone up to a level where we can all engage in this work to make sure that we are tearing down these walls of injustice, that we are pushing aside the things that cause disparity, and that we're making sure that we're all included in this work, in this conversation, and in the benefits that we're hoping will come out on the other side.
Keith, make sure you unmute.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, let me start by offering something that one of my teammates shared with me early this week. Happened to be a Caucasian teammate who reached out just to check in on me and provide some support. But he shared that I understand that I will never understand. However, I stand. That's what I find encouraging. That there's a willingness, perhaps not by all, but by many, whether they're Black, brown, or white, that we're better than this. And given the recent events, it's created a real sense of urgency. And I'm proud that my company, Bank of America, responded. So early this week, if you hadn't seen it, we announced a $1 billion commitment over 4 years to provide additional support to assist local communities that are really addressing economic and racial inequality. $1 billion. Now, one of the reasons we were able to respond as quickly as we did to announce it is because several of us within the company were already working on something, because, Jesse, as you know so well, COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on the Black and brown community. So we were concerned about that. We all recognize that the economy is struggling at this point in time. We're concerned about small businesses and are they going to be able to reopen and sustain. So we had activity underway, but I'll be honest with you, what we were proposing to our CEO was pale in comparison to what he committed to. He decided to double down And so
So
for all of us, that's the encouraging piece, that we're going to be committed, doubling down, tripling down on home ownership and affordable housing, on jobs and job training, supporting historically Black colleges and universities, but not just stopping there, ensuring that we look at alternative education, community colleges, junior colleges, high schools. We've been talking for years to try to put us in a position, Jesse, you know this well, those that have committed a felony, and because we're heavily regulated, may not have an opportunity to work for us. But that felony may have been they hit someone when they were 13 and got charged with a felonious assault. It's not a financial crime, and they can never work in our industry. Those are things that we know that we must change now. And so this sense of urgency to support small businesses in Black and brown communities, we know that they're going to be challenged coming out of this crisis that we're in right now. It's been accelerated because of this pandemic. We know, yes, we made a decision, Jesse, as you know, that minimum wage for us is $20 an hour. We wanted a working, livable wage for a family of four if you worked for Bank of America, but it's not enough. We want people to have careers. And so we're going to triple down in our commitment to hiring more people from Black and brown communities, train them, work with local organizations to help find these students that didn't go through the traditional route, may never have gone to college, but we have programs that enable you to complete your degree. So that's what gives me encouragement. $1 billion is a lot of money, but it comes down to a commitment to ensure that we're focused on sustainability and making a true impact in the communities that we serve.
yeah. So Kayla, I want to take a different spin on that question. I agree with everything that Keith has said. And I can assure you, you're going to have corporate entities like Bank of America, like Novant, like many companies that they will give more money, they will write more checks, they will hire more people, we will create entry points. We will look at college degrees and those that don't have them differently. We will create ways to create more access. So I will tell you those things are going to happen. But in my view, that's not what's going to change the shift, right? In my view, the change that we're talking about is deeper than the transactional things around even housing and everything. We need those things. I'm the biggest advocate for social determinants of health, and that's housing and transportation and jobs and all of those things. I can be a very wealthy individual and still experience racism. I can have a home, I can have transportation, and still experience racism. My children have gone to great schools. They're going to be professionals. They will still experience racism. And so where this has to go is a level around dealing with the reality of racism and social injustice that's real. And we can't do it by ourselves. Braxton, the point I was making about COVID was it takes a pandemic type of movement to make that level of change. And that's the level of change that we're going to have to really change this country. In regards to companies and Black Lives Matter, what I will tell you is before 2016, I sat in boardrooms and I sat in corporate rooms, and I could literally have a debate with people that, people feeling as though we're at a place where we don't need affirmative action and things are better and that sort of thing. I remember having those debates. 2016 changed those debates, particularly in Charlotte. 2016 changed those debates. But the response to what occurred was still the transactionals, more jobs, do we create access? And we need all of those things. I think that 2020 is going to make this more about how do we change people? How do we impact social justice? How do we impact injustice? And that's going to be a conversation. And we need our white brothers and our white sisters to be at that table and standing up. We can't do this by ourselves. We can't own social injustice. We can't own racism, right? And so that, in my view, is the paradigm shift that companies are leading. I will tell you a quick story in reference to Novant Health. Many of you may have seen our position statement of who we are. We've sent it out social media. It's a very powerful statement. I will tell you that one of the things that's in this statement, and I'll read a couple of lines. We are Novant Health. We exist to save lives, all lives. We believe Black lives matter, period. In the midst of pandemic, the epidemic of racism has once again shaken us all. We call for empathy, compassion, and zero tolerance of racism from all. We heal bodies every day, but we know only through social justice can we heal the soul of our community, because if society isn't healthy, no one isn't healthy. That would not have happened 5 years ago. That's a bold statement. And so to your point, people are understanding why Black Lives Matter. We know white lives matter. We know white lives matter. Our society tells us that. But understanding why Black lives matter, because we have to invest in the Black lives. We have been brutalized. And in my view, that's the shift.
Well, and great point, and I totally agree. And I wonder, is there anything, Professor, in history that can kind of give us hope on this point? Because great point, Jesse, that it's going to take almost a shift in the way people think, feel, and I'm encouraged by seeing all of our white allies out there marching, but they have to also, pick up that mantle. And is there anything in history that can help us with this, or help guide our white allies and people who actually want to be supportive?
I think that we can take a lesson from Mississippi Freedom Summer. If we think about the fact that organizations like SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, brought in white college students from mainly northern institutions, for those people that aren't familiar, who spent weeks in the Mississippi Delta. Now, Mississippi was a state that, in terms of racial injustice, in terms of economic injustice, you're talking about communities that had some of the poorest Black people across the country, large populations of Black people, many of which did not have voting rights. So you had organizations like CORE and like SNCC that brought in young white college students into these areas for a couple different reasons. One, the issues that Black people were facing were largely going unnoticed or overlooked by mainstream Americans, right? Often what was happening in the Black community, most Americans were comfortable with turning a blind eye to and pretending like it wasn't happening. The paradigm shifted whenever their children began to take up the fight in the Mississippi Delta and throughout the South. So whenever their children became those people on the front lines, whenever their children became those people that were having the hoses turned on them and the dogs unleashed on them, when their children became the people that were having their eyes gouged out. I remember listening to a story from a white SNCC worker who had participated in some of the protests in the South in from the early to the mid 60s. And he talked about a police officer targeting him, a white police officer targeting him because he was a white man in support of this Afrocentric movement, and trying to gouge his eyes out to basically get him. He was holding on to a rail on some steps because he was trying to get him into a position where he could assault him. And so when he would not release the stairs, he went for his eyeballs to get him to release the stairs. The point that I'm making is that we have had moments where interracial activism has been incredibly effective in bringing about change. And in those moments, and I use Mississippi as an example, because not only did you have young white students who were engaged in this fight alongside their Black brothers and sisters, but they were also exposed to how Black people live. So not only were they going to the front line and the protests and the pickets and so forth, but they were literally living in the homes of members of Mississippi's Black community, right? They were eating at their tables. They were bathing the same ways that these Black families bathe. They had a chance to see the disparities that African Americans were experiencing firsthand. And so again, it goes back to this conversation about knowledge and being educated. So not just about, what's happening in this moment, but what has happened to get us to this moment. How are people in various spaces being affected in this moment? And it goes back to the point that Jesse was making about COVID and this pandemic being a sort of game-changing moment. Because what is really happening here is we get an opportunity to see the underbelly of the nation. The disparities that Americans are facing is becoming front page news. And people who would typically sort of ignore or overlook what's happening to people, not just Black people, but poor people, and the list goes on and on. We're now having to come face to face with the realities of the disparities, of the injustices, of the inequalities, of the exclusion, the discrimination that our nation continues to grapple with. And so I think that I'll say again, I think Mississippi Freedom Summer is a perfect sort of example of how not only the youth can create change and how there's a power. They bring an energy to movement. They bring an energy to activism that as older people we can't quite muster all the time. And they're more. They have vision. They're intuitive. They're innovative, and they're in touch with the community in ways that we're not. But the other piece is that having the cooperation of our white brothers and sisters, I think, is really important. And not just that, I think, it has to be intersectional in terms of faith. It has to be intersectional in terms of race. It has to be intersectional in terms of ethnicity, in terms of community. This has to be all hands on deck. And I think that we have seen moments where this has been really successful and we've seen major change as a result. Mississippi was never the same because Mississippi Freedom Summer happened. And because all of those young people convened in that space, and you had those politicians who were calling down to the South and saying, hold on, my son is there. So you can't handle that situation the way you normally would because our children are down there. And so it brings attention to a moment like that, but it also causes, the powers to be, if you will, to sort of take a different kind of approach and listen with a different kind of ear in these types of moments.
Thank you, Professor.
I would just like to point out, Dr. Mcknight and Jesse just explained two things that, again, while it might take movements, the ultimate action actually happens on the political level. It is, again, political will. What you hear is Dr. Dixon Mcknight say is that you had politicians from up north contacting politicians down south and saying, do what you could have already done before my daughter went down there, but because my daughter has gone down there, I need this vote to go this way. I need this policy to be changed. Jesse mentioned this pandemic moment. I agree that this pandemic is showing a lot. But what I was saying, Jesse, was not to cut at your point. What I was saying is, what did you see? What have you seen that has happened on a policy level, right? We have stopped evictions, right? Before COVID happened, you would have said, you know what? You can't do that. It's going to destroy the mortgage, the mortgage investment market. It's going to mess up the courts. There's going to be pandemonium. Well, you know what actually has happened? It has saved lives. And yes, there are other problems that we have to fix, but most of those problems within the system have to do with other policies and changes and prioritizing of spending, again, political decisions. So sometimes I guess movement has to happen to create the political will, but in the end, all it takes for these changes to happen are words on paper and men and women to vote or sign their names on that paper to make those changes happen.
Can I make one more point, Kama?
Of course.
I was just going to say also to sort of piggyback off of that and to sort of expand a little bit on the point I was making earlier. I think it's also important for us to understand two really key things. One, that one person truly can make a difference. And I know that sounds cliche, But I think a lot of what's happening, and I experienced some of this myself, is trying to figure out what can I do. And so the political piece that Braxton is talking about on a very basic level, voting, right? We have to make sure, and that's what the folks in Mississippi were doing. That's what SNCC was doing across the South, what CORE was doing across the South, getting communities, Black communities, to the voting polls, because there is power. There is power in having political representation and having that voice on a political, in the political realm. So there's that piece. The one voice, one person can't make a difference. But the other piece that I wanted to raise is we have to also figure out how to empower people to feel empowered to act on their own behalf. And I'll take back, I'll go back to, a leader like, or someone who didn't want to call herself a leader, but Ella Baker, for instance, or Fannie Lou Hamer, two of my sheroes and favorite people of all time. But these are two individuals who truly believe that we don't have to sort of brand people leaders. We don't have to go into communities and insert leaders. We have to empower people to lead themselves. We have to empower people to change their own communities, giving them the tools and the knowledge and the information to know that you don't have to look to someone outside of who you are and where you live, right, to change your circumstances. You yourselves have the power to do that for yourselves, and then make connections to the work you're doing on the ground at a grassroots level to be able to affect change politically in the upper echelons of government and so forth. But certainly wanting, people to know that it doesn't have to be sort of a grandiose, it doesn't have to be public, right? It doesn't have to get news coverage. It can be something very simple. Going back to the 10 points on the decree that the Black Panther Party originally put out, the 10-point program. Choose one of those. A friend of mine shared that with me when I was asking that question. What can I do? Right? Choose one of those things and figure out a way to affect change in your community. And if we can all do that at a grassroots level, then that collective action will then cause us to build on something much bigger and much broader and even more powerful.
That's a great point. And I don't want to stifle this at all, because we could probably do this all night, but we have lots of questions coming from the audience, and we want to give, a little bit of time to hear from the audience, have them ask you guys some questions. So I'm going to ask Alex to pull up a question for us and see. We have Hunter who asks, what does history tell us about qualified immunity and how the current law compares to its original intent? How has it influenced cases in the past and the ones that are currently being tried today? I'm thinking that's you, Professor.
That might be a little bit out of my purview. Wait a minute, let me read that again. What does history tell us about qualified immunity and how the current law compares to its original intent? So somebody help me. What are we talking about with qualified immunity?
I'm trying right now. It's a legal doctrine in the United States federal law that shields government officials from being sued for discretionary actions performed within the official capacity.
We're probably hitting on a precedent. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So I think, what's interesting, and I don't know enough about the law, and I was trying to see that second part of the question. I don't know enough about the law to speak specifically. Okay, how is influence? Okay, I don't know enough about sort of the language of law to speak to that second question with clear knowledge at this point. So I don't want to answer that and not know exactly what I'm talking about. But what I will say is that what I do know about the way that this nation has evolved in terms of how government has, and I think that's what the person is asking about, sort of what's the limit of power what's the limit of repercussion for people in power? Is that the question? Am I sort of understanding that correctly?
But it is a legal question, and I'm gonna get us off the hook with that one because we're
Okay.
gonna bring on some legal experts coming forward, and
Okay.
it's a rabbit hole. But I'm gonna ask Alex to send us another one that kind of is within our purview.
So one thing I will say, it gets in these discussions, there are so many problems with systems. And when you're talking about systems, there are so many different inputs, right? So sometimes it can be difficult to have a discussion. When we're talking about, if we want to talk about police accountability again and police reform, yes, we can look at all the layers and try to attack all the layers at once. You can look at federal law and things like that. But really, police reform it happens at the local level. So federal law, state law can be made, and that affects what happens in the court of law once you enter the judicial process. But most of our interactions, for instance, with police, are before we actually get within that process. So what you need to affect there are policies, right? Those are the things that we can control, that you and I as citizens can control and can happen and make change tomorrow.
And I also want to point out, to piggyback off that, that goes back to the conversation about who we're coming in contact with in these roles. And so part of what law or how law operates is that there is some room for interpretation, right? And so the question is, who is the individual that we're coming in contact with in that moment, and how are they interpreting the law or the policy for that matter? And so if it's someone, which goes back to the point that I think both Jesse and Keith have made about sort of, and Braxton, about the systemic change, there has to be something that's unearthed from the ground up and figuring out a new direction. Because if we're talking about people who are operating in a systemically racist environment, then the way that they interpret these laws and these policies are then impacted by the way that they view or the way they interpret the laws, and also by the people they're coming in contact with, whether it's a brown or black person at the other end of that nightstick or the other end of that that gun or the knee for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to have to unpack. I mean, there are so many issues around the legality, the intent of the Constitution. I mean, we're over 250 years with that Constitution, and how, this president and this administration and this has really stretched, so many areas of constitutional rights. And so I'm going to table that for this group, because that is another 2 hours. We have another question here. Why is so much money going to the police in the budget? Is that one that you can tackle, Councilman?
Absolutely. Again, practically speaking, your city council controls all city spending. We are being proposed a $2.55 billion budget, and it is entirely our prerogative, the adjustments that get made to that budget. So what goes in and what goes out after the manager recommends a budget to us. So it's there because the people with the political power and the political will have decided that 40% of our general fund budget, about $290 million, is needed to fulfill the responsibilities and mission of the police department. I don't necessarily agree with all of that, but that is how it has been over the years. I know that's a very black and white answer. We are an organization with about 8,000 employees. About 2,000 of those employees exist in Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police. Those are both sworn officers and civilian officers. Those spends go to salaries, as well as all the equipment. So whether it be for uniforms, the ammunition, to chemical agents, police cars, helicopters, all of those tools, every piece of protective equipment that we give, that is what it gets spent on.
Well,
Thank you.
If I could,
Please.
and I'm not the expert here, but I'm willing to listen and learn more. But the question I would propose is that, do we really need to increase budgets for policing? Or do we really need to rethink policing in the 21st century? We now know that we criminalized drugs for so long. We've incarcerated Black men and Black and brown people for the use of drugs. And now we have a completely different view of painkillers and opiates, and decriminalize that. If we could ever address gun laws here, maybe we wouldn't have to have local police that look like military, and the investments that we're making there. Currently, we've had a very strong economy. I think there are more job openings in Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department than they can fill right now. So there's probably a budget surplus, to be quite candid with you. So I don't know if spending more in this area, I know that we've got a lot of rhetoric around law and order right now, but I'd say this: leadership matters. And this great experiment that we've had for the last 3.5 years, hopefully we've learned our lesson. And that I agree with the earlier comments, and I'd echo that we all have power, and that power is to vote, and not just individually vote, but we have to make a commitment to ensure that we register people like we've never registered before in our community, and we help them and ensure that they actually get to the polls to vote.
And that there's no obstacles to that, right?
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for that. You know, I'm looking at the time, and I do not want to stop this, but we want to take this one last question from Monique. For anyone on the panel, she asked, as the mother of a young Black teenage male, he wants to make changes in his school and in his community. What are some action steps that he can take? And you just talked about one of them, Keith. You know, and he might not be old enough to vote, but when he needs to learn about what that obligation is and that process is, and the young can go out there and register to vote, right? What else?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'd also add dream big. You know, there's so many programs that are available now to the youth. I know what changed my life. It was people who made an investment in me, whether those were not beyond my parents. I'm talking about teachers and coaches that gave me hope, introduced me to things that, you know, at best I could just read about. And so there are many, many great organizations, whether that's Big Brothers and Big Sisters, whether that's Young Black Leaders, that I'd encourage them to get engaged in so they can get exposed to different things. So you're so young, there's so much that you don't even know about yourself that you're going to discover. And getting engaged in the community and being a leader, not just voting and encouraging people to vote, but invest in yourself.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any final thought from all of you before we say adieu to our guests?
I think you know, one thing, I just got finished sending a message to Oaklawn Academy, Oaklawn Middle School's graduating class, and I have a 13-year-old Black male son. You know, you have to be honest with them. I think, and I'm learning from people like Keith and Jesse of how to do things like this. I'm grateful to have particularly Black men in my life, especially Black men that find themselves in this hyper duality, right? We exist in as Black men every day, but we work in these predominantly white worlds, and we have had some amount of success in those worlds, right? The talented 10th, but this is true for everybody, right? You have to let him know that, you know, you have to protect yourself all the time. And that doesn't mean that you always have to be defensive. That doesn't mean that you always have to be on guard, but you have to be aware, right? As Jesse said, it doesn't matter how much money that you make, your body will be seen as a threat, or it will be coveted. And that has an enormous amount of responsibility, personal responsibility, as you walk down the street by yourself, as you sit in that classroom and you have different reactions, or when you are in the company of others. So there is no real book that they give us as we figure this out. But it is up to us. It is an unfortunate responsibility that we have to be aware of our Blackness and aware of what that does to everybody around us. And there is a way to use that to your advantage, but there is certainly a way that this world tries to use it to your disadvantage. Figure that out, and you will be very successful.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to weigh in or have a last word before we say goodnight?
Sure, Cam. I would say, first of all, again, thanks for giving us the opportunity, to have this dialogue. To Keith's point, we have to vote. To put Braxton on the spot a little bit, we need to keep Braxton in office because he brings a voice. And we need that. All of us play a role, right? We have people in corporate America. We need people like Braxton in office, making a difference, challenging the status quo. And then lastly, all of us can make a difference where we are. Every one of us can make a difference where we are. If it's connecting to someone that's in your office and talking with them about what it feels like and social justice and injustice, whether you're leading a company or you're working in a company, you challenge your company to think about diversity and inclusion in a much different way. And what is our civic duty as a corporation? All of us can make a difference where we are. And if we do that, that's a step in the right direction. And we'll keep this movement going because it is a movement.
Absolutely.
And if I could just add, Kayla, very quickly, stay engaged with us. I'm greatly pleased that people tuned in this evening. This is part of a series, a dialogue that we want to continue to have. We know that it's very necessary. There's a sense of urgency here. We want to respond. We've got upcoming events here at the Levine Museum of the New South. We believe that this is the New South, that this combination of understanding history so we don't repeat it. So we can make the promise for a better future for not only ourselves, but also our children that are coming behind us. So stay engaged with us. Look for more programming. Help us understand what you want to discuss. And just know that at this moment in time, there's a tremendous opportunity for us to listen. Not just stay wedded in our point of view or listen to the same cable news channel that we listen to, but learn, listen. Understand that we all have lived experiences that are different.
Yeah.
And the events of these last few weeks have spotlighted that so painfully for all of us. And I hope that we'll all just pause for a moment to engage. Don't be fearful. Engage. Ask questions and just listen.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Keith, that was perfect. Professor, you want to say one more thing?
Really quickly, I just wanted to say thank you. This has been really, really good for me, and I'm excited to connect with you all again to figure out ways to move forward and be able to make contribution in our communities. But also, I just wanted to get back to the question that you asked or that Monique posed about the young people. I am a mother of 4 children, 3 girls and 1 boy. And at this point in our lives, we're just as concerned about our young Black girls as we are about our young Black boys. And so, I'll go back to what I've been saying, as a historian and someone that teaches history, I think that's a powerful tool. It's important for all of us to understand truly, and it sounds cliche, but it is absolutely the truth about understanding where we've been in order for us to be prepared and to build in order to move forward. I fear that there is a pervasive lack of knowledge throughout our community. And that's something I think that we as individuals in our own homes, in our own communities, in our own churches, our own community centers and what have you, can begin to eradicate. And making sure that our children are fully aware of not just who they are, but from whence they come, the shoulders they stand on. I think that's incredibly important. I think it will help to empower them as they move forward to be the people in their communities that affect change, to be the voice in the next generation. And I think it's just really important for us to go back to that old adage that knowledge is power, because it truly is.
Yes. Thank you, Professor. You guys have been an amazing panel. And, I think the topic of tonight was, what is it going to take? We obviously don't have all the answers, but you're absolutely right. This kind of discussion, planning, we are going to hopefully not stay at this place. I started the evening off naming the names of the people who were basically modern lynchings. And so I think it's appropriate that I close the evening out for the Levine Museum and for all of us with a statement, a quote from Brian Stevenson, who has dedicated his life in this area. And he writes, "The greatest evil of American slavery was not involuntary servitude, but rather the narrative of racial differences we created to legitimize slavery. Because we never dealt with that evil, I don't think slavery ended in 1865. It just evolved." So on that thought, we look forward to seeing you again. And thank you, panelists, for your time. And if you're so inclined, we appreciate your support. And please take our survey so that when we come back to you, we are having the kind of conversations and discussions that help push us forward. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Right.